War in the world. The cost.
World War I, 1914 to 1918. Deaths, 15 to 65 million. Cost, over $60.6 billion US. Not included are emotional, psychological, physical, and spiritual damage for people, children, and future generations. Aftermath. Germany's war reparation debt of 70 million euros, or 300 billion euros in today's currency, took 92 years to be paid off. Other post-war costs, including care for disabled soldiers, reconstruction, moving and burying the perished, and the building of cemeteries and memorials for soldiers. Inestimable numbers of unexploded shells and other ammunition remain in battlefields, causing further injuries and fatalities to this day. Deep trauma led to the term lost generation in describing those who came of age during World War I.
Russian Civil War, 1917 to 1921. Deaths, 5 to 9 million. Cost, $35 billion US. Displaced, 2 million. Aftermath. Overall production fell to 20% of the pre-war production. Agriculture fell to 37% of normal production, contributing to the Russian famine of 1921.
World War II, 1939 to 1945. Deaths, up to 72 million, representing 3.1% of the 1939 world population, making it the deadliest war ever, with up to 11 million killed in the Holocaust. Displaced, up to 20 million. Cost, $4 trillion US. Aftermath. European and Soviet Union economies collapsed with much of their industrial infrastructure destroyed. Of the displaced people, nearly all were malnourished, with many who were ill or subsequently perished. With hundreds of thousands of women who were sexually assaulted, some 10,000 in Germany later died, mostly by suicide. Many post-war soldiers were afflicted with acute post-traumatic stress disorder, which was observed in veterans even decades later. Cities were annihilated by bombing. Radiation from the Hiroshima and Nagasaki nuclear explosions instantly killed 140,000 people, up to 350,000 others succumbing eventually. Animals and plants also perished to high levels of radiation.
India-Pakistani wars. 4 main wars from 1947 to 1999, plus ongoing. Deaths, 28,270. Cost. Military costs to India and Pakistan, a combined $3 billion US. Lost tourism revenue of $3.6 billion US. Between 2004 and 2008, India and Pakistan lost potential trade income of at least $12 billion US, and counting. Unexploded munitions, leftover landmines and other explosives in the border regions of both countries cause hundreds of fatalities each year. Not included are emotional, psychological, physical and spiritual damage for people, children and future generations.
Arab-Israeli conflict, 1948 to present. Deaths, 74,000 military, 18,000 civilians. Displaced, 1.7 million of 4 million Palestinians are refugees. Costs, the U.S. government pays $3 billion US annually to aid Israel's military, while the total cost of Arab-Israeli conflict to U.S. taxpayers since World War II is $3 trillion US in 2002 dollars, $114 billion US of which was direct aid to Israel. And counting. Aftermath. Economic costs. Reduced national income of $12 trillion US for Israel and the Arab nations, with up to trillions of dollars in lost economic opportunities due to conflict. Mental health. 80% of Palestinian children suffer from behavioral and sleep problems, as well as increasing levels of violence and reduced hope in the future. Over 90% of Israelis, meanwhile, report that they live with a feeling of insecurity.
Korean War, 1950 to 1953 armistice. Deaths, 4 million. Cost, $678 billion US for 1951 to 1953, $1 billion US for 1951 to 2000, and counting. Aftermath. The war technically is still not over. In the decades following the ceasefire armistice, hundreds more have been killed in incidents near the inter-Korean border, and millions of families were permanently separated. Soldiers sent there to fight suffered high rates of post-traumatic stress disorder and depression, according to one study of Australian veterans.
Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975. Deaths, 1.5 million military, up to 4 million civilians. Injuries, over 600,000 northern, 1.5 million southern. Costs, USA spent $111 billion US, or $686 billion US in 2008 dollars. Not included are emotional, psychological, physical, and spiritual damage for people, children, and future generations. Aftermath. Displaced, over 3 million fled Ao Lac or Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, mostly by boat, seeking refuge in other countries from the violence. Environment. The spread of herbicides such as Agent Orange by U.S. troops to defoliate the countryside left behind a poisoned food chain and an estimated 4 million affected by disease, with children who are still being born missing limbs and with other disabilities. In the U.S., children born to veterans exposed to Agent Orange also have a higher incidence of diseases including prostate cancer, diabetes, and nerve disorders. Economic costs. Indirect and direct costs such as benefits for veterans and slower U.S. economic growth equals around $900 billion US. Mental health. 30% of U.S. soldiers experienced mental disorders and substance abuse following the war.
Colombian armed conflict, 1964 to present. Deaths, up to 200,000. Cost, $2.67 billion US annually by Colombian government. And counting.
Cambodian War, 1970 to 1979. Deaths, 4 million, 56% of 1970 population. Refugees, 350,000. Aftermath, a high percentage of those who survived had their lives destroyed, suffering from severe depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, with children who had witnessed violence, joining gangs as teens and even murdering others. 40,000 amputees due to landmines and unexploded munitions, one of the highest rates in the world. 4 to 6 million landmines and other munitions still contaminate around 20% of villages, reducing incomes due to lack of access to water, fields and forests. Families with one or more people disabled by explosives are much more likely to live in poverty.
Timor-Leste, or East Timor. Occupation, 1975 to 1999. Deaths, 200,000 from military violence, starvation and disease. Refugees, 300,000, almost half of the population, were forced into camps in West Timor. By 1999, 70% of infrastructure was destroyed, including homes, irrigation, water supply systems, schools, and electricity grid. Aftermath. Economy continues to be affected, with 53% of the population living on less than $1 per day. The country ranks 158th out of 170 in the Human Development Index, indicating low achievement in life expectancy, education, and standard of living.
Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 1988. Deaths and injuries, up to 1 million Iranians, 300,000 Iraqis. Costs, initial cost of $1.2 trillion US, or $600 billion US each.
Not included are emotional, psychological, physical, and spiritual damage for people, children, and future generations.
Aftermath. Economic costs. Slowdown in economic growth for both countries, with reduced funds leading collapses in key areas such as scientific and technological productivity. Unexploded munitions, with around 20 million landmines still in the ground. Iraq is considered one of the most mine-contaminated countries in the world.
Sudanese Civil War, 1983 to 2005. Deaths, 2 million due to war, famine, and disease. Displaced, 80% of the population, or 4 million people, forced to leave their homes at least once. Many women and girls sexually assaulted, 11,000 abducted for slavery. Aftermath. Economic costs, 66% reduction in the nation's ability to invest in improvements, and 8% reduction in national income from 1986 to 1990 alone. Conflict across all of Africa costs nations an average of 15% of their income per year. Mental health. Among Sudanese refugees, 32% suffered post-traumatic stress disorder, 20% suffered psychological disorders.
Sri Lankan Civil War, 1983 to 2009. Deaths, 20,000 to 100,000. Displaced, more than 400,000. Costs, over $200 billion US.
Aftermath. Hundreds of thousands in refugee camps suffer from malnutrition and lack of water, medicine and sanitation. The nation's tourism industry destroyed, as well as main infrastructure, with government revenues diverted from social projects. An estimated 1.5 million landmines and other explosives in the north continue to be a hindrance to the resettling of conflict-displaced citizens.
Second Congo War, 1988 to 2003, officially ongoing. Deaths, up to 5.4 million fatalities between 1998 and 2008, making it the deadliest conflict since World War II. Most deaths were from disease and famine, with almost half killed being children. Cost, $18 billion US in lost income to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and it remains one of the world's 2 poorest countries. And counting. Aftermath. Displaced. Fighting has continued for years after official end. Millions have been displaced. Victims of over 40,000 cases of systemic sexual violence continuing till today, with associated physical and psychological trauma, as well as the spread of HIV and other diseases.
All provinces remain affected by landmines and other explosives, preventing both resettling and reconstruction.
Iraq-Kuwait Gulf War, 1991. Deaths, up to 36,592 military, 4,664 civilians. Environment. Iraqi forces dumped 400 million gallons of oil into the Gulf and set fire to Kuwaiti oil wells, causing widespread environmental damage to the Persian Gulf and the desert. Costs. $6.1 billion for coalition nations, $1.5 billion extra for extinguishing oil fires. Aftermath. Health. 200,000 U.S. troops sickened by exposure to chemicals developed profound fatigue, gastrointestinal and respiratory disorders, joint and muscle pain, memory loss, depression, and dizziness. Economic costs. The UN ordered Iraq to pay $200 billion to victims, including individuals and companies, which was a factor in Iraq's subsequent slowed economic recovery.
Yugoslav wars, 1991 to 1995, 1999 Kosovo crisis, deaths 127,000, cost $60 billion in damage for 1999 war alone. Aftermath. Water, air and soil contamination, release of cancer and other disease-causing chemicals.
Somalia Civil War, 1991 to present. Deaths up to 1 million due to fighting, famine and disease. Displaced 1.4 million.
Not included are emotional, psychological, physical and spiritual damage for people, children and future generations.
Cambodian-Thai border dispute 2008 to present. Deaths 44 to 221. Displacement. Approximately 22,000 Thai citizens reportedly have had to abandon their homes.
Rwandan Civil War, 1994. Deaths 500,000 to 1 million killed in 100 days, 7 to 13% of population. 250,000 to 500,000 women sexually assaulted. Aftermath. Displaced. 2 million became refugees, thousands of whom died of diseases in refugee camps. Widespread sexually transmitted diseases and thousands of pregnancies from sexual assault. Economic costs. National income, as of 2005, remains up to 25% lower than if the war had not occurred. Mental health. 25% of population known to have suffered post-traumatic stress disorder.
Afghanistan War, 2001 to present. Deaths. 54,000 to 74,000 military, Taliban members and civilians killed. Injured 59,500. Aftermath. Mental health. 60% of Afghans suffer from mental health disorders, while 20% of U.S. Afghan veterans suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder or mental issues. Economic costs. U.S. costs of both Afghan and Iraq wars over $5 trillion, including medical expenses for injured veterans, costs to U.S. families of deceased soldiers, debt interest and harms to U.S. economy. And counting.
Unexploded munitions. Some 40 people are killed or maimed monthly, while economic development is hindered because farmland is unusable.
Darfur conflict, Sudan, 2003 to 2009-2010. Deaths, 150 military, 300,000 civilians. Displaced, 2.7 million. Costs. UN and African Union troops sent to Darfur in 2007 cost an estimated $2 billion in the first year. And counting. Aftermath. Women in refugee camps continue to be at risk of sexual assault. Mental health. Among those displaced within Sudan, 54% experienced post-traumatic stress disorder and 70% experienced general distress.
Iraq War, 2003 to present. Deaths up to 750,000. Injured 72,539. Costs $704 billion in direct costs to U.S. and counting. Aftermath. Mental. 60 to 70% of Iraqi children suffer psychological problems, while 20% of U.S. veterans suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder or mental issues, costing $6.2 billion in the 2 years after returning from deployment.
Unexploded munitions. In the village of Said Jabbar alone, 16% of the population has been killed or injured by landmines and other explosives.
Economic costs. A Nobel Prize-winning economist estimates the total costs, including health care for disabled veterans, interest on debt and others, be in excess of $5 trillion and counting. The price of oil has also quadrupled since 2002.